Okay, welcome back to the next paper on school closures and distance learning. And the presenter is Caroline Hall, with co-authors Ines Hardardottir and Martin Lundin. Please, Caroline.
Thank you. So the topic of our paper is the expected effects of school closures and online teaching in the Nordic countries. So as we all know, the COVID-19 pandemic has implied an enormous shock to education systems across the world, as most governments have taken precautionary measures of closing schools and switching to online teaching or remote learning in order to reduce the spread of the virus. Many scholars have already pointed out and assessed that this is likely to have a great impact on learning with potential long-run consequences. But the measures put in place in the education systems have varied quite a lot across countries. And so has also the preparedness of the different education systems to quickly switch to remote learning. So in our article, we take a closer look at the school closures and the use of distance learning in the different Nordic countries, focusing on compulsory and upper secondary school. And in light of the preparedness of the education systems, but also in the light of several reports summarizing the experiences of students and teachers during this time period, we try to discuss the expected impact of distance learning, both in the short and in the longer run. And to do this, we draw on research on causal effects of distance learning conducted before the pandemic, but also on the relevant studies that we can find that have been carried out during the pandemic. So what can we expect from a move to distance learning? Well, if from a more theoretical starting point, distance learning could actually have both positive and negative effects on how much students learn. One advantage with this mode of instruction that is often highlighted in the literature is the amount of the increased flexibility that this mode of instruction implies for students. So you have the possibility to access course material many times whenever it suits you, for instance, recorded lectures. You can also more decide yourself on what content you want to focus on. You can spend more time on the parts you find difficult and skip the parts that you have already mastered. But it's likely, so on the negative sides, distance learning requires much more from the students themselves in terms of planning and self-discipline. And students that struggle with these aspects, they of course run an increasing risk of falling behind. And here we can expect a strong age gradient where this is likely to be much more difficult the younger the students are and increasingly dependent on parental assistance. Also on the negative sides, there are many fewer opportunities for interactions, both with other students and between students and teachers. For the teachers, this means also that it's harder to adjust the lectures according to the students' particular needs. But the social interactions at school can also be important, not just for learning, but also for the development of non-cognitive skills. Also on the negative side, we could add that there's less social pressure to perform, and this could also, less social interaction could also affect motivation in a negative way. So to what extent have schools then in the Nordic countries been open and closed during the pandemic? In the paper, we have tried to provide a more detailed overview over the extent of school closures and the use of distance learning. And I would just provide an extremely brief summary. I also want to add, because we're in Iceland, that we have struggled a bit to find information on Iceland in particular. So if anyone know of any relevant studies that we have missed, we would be very thankful for that information. Both Denmark and Norway, they had a period starting in March 2020 when all schools shut down and distance learning was used for kids of all ages. School closures lasted between 4 to 8 weeks and generally lasting longer the older the students. And the strategy in Finland seemed to be very similar, but with the exceptions that children in grade 1 to 3 could always attend school. But at the same time, there was a strong recommendation to also use distance learning for this age group. Iceland, during this time period, they closed upper secondary school and they imposed certain limitations on the younger children. The activities seems to have been limited at school during this time. Sweden, on the other hand, only used remote instruction in upper secondary school. So this was the first semester that we cover. During the remainder of the period, all 5 countries have tried to keep at least compulsory schools open as much as possible. But there have often been a lot of regional and local variation in policies. So a general approach has been to tie school closures to the amount of COVID cases locally. So it means like there's been a lot of back and forth in certain places, and that a lot of kids have been in certain regions have been much more exposed than in other regions. So there's a lot of regional variation. Overall, Sweden stands out as having kept schools open to a much greater extent than the other countries. For a quick switch or for remote learning to work effectively in practice, we need access to digital technology. And in terms of this, all the Nordic countries seem to have come a rather long way already before the pandemic. The OECD rates all the Nordic countries as being among the best in the world in terms of digital preparedness. Even in the most disadvantaged schools, the bottom 25%, above 90% of the students that wrote the PISA test in 2018, they reported that they had access to a computer and internet at home, which they could use in their schoolwork. And it's rather common in all the Nordic countries for schools to actually provide the students with their own computer, especially in upper secondary school. It's more of an exception than to not have been given a computer by the school. But of course, also computer access decreases by student age. Teacher preparedness to teach digital is of course also important. There is a survey conducted by the OECD from 2018 where around 20% of the teachers in lower secondary school in both Finland, Sweden, Norway, and Iceland reported that they had quite a high need for professional development in this area. Here, Denmark stands out as seeming more prepared. But on the other hand, 80% of the teachers report that they don't have this at least strong need. Important also to highlight here is that it seems to be the case, what we can see, that children who had limited computer access and internet at home, they have been offered instruction generally at the school, even though the schools in general was closed. And this also often applies to students with a vulnerable home environment and students with special needs. So overall, what we can see is that at least in terms of digital preparedness, all the Nordic countries seem rather well prepared. And this is in very sharp contrast to what we see in a lot of other countries in the world, where distance learning has often been hard to carry out at all because a lot of students lack access to technology. So how has distance learning then worked in practice? So there are lots over these years, there are more and more studies coming out that in different ways try to assess how it's worked in practice from all the Nordic countries. These studies are many. They are of varying quality, often because they have also been carried out during a very short time period. They're often also based on non-representative samples. So it's a bit hard to know how much one can generalize. But then on the other hand, a lot of reports, they arrived rather similar conclusions. So we think that there is much that we can learn from them still. And I will give a very brief overview of the picture that emerges from these reports. One common observation is that the digital infrastructure is not really regarded as a main obstacle. Surveys among teachers and students, they often conclude that most teachers and students seem to think that that learning has worsened during times when remote instruction has been used. Teachers find it more difficult to help the students reach the educational objectives. They find it challenging to motivate the students and create an engaging classroom environment. They also find it hard to notice if students need additional help. There are some indications, and this comes specifically from a study from Norway, that there might be groups of specifically young students that in fact had very little contact with the teacher during when schools were closed, so that the responsibility for teaching was to a big extent put on the parents during this time. There are indications that depressive symptoms seem to have increased, and this is a study from Iceland, and especially for girls and for older teens. Many reports point out that certain groups are likely to be more adversely affected than others. Vulnerable groups, for instance, new immigrants, and also students with a poor study environment at home. Another very common observation is that distance learning works much better for older than for younger students. Some subjects are more difficult to teach online, for instance, practical elements, workplace-based learning. And also assessment and grading is more difficult. Adding to this is the fact that standardized national exams generally have been canceled during this time period. And interestingly, what we can see is that in both Norway and Sweden, the grades among both lower secondary school and upper secondary school students have increased during this time period, and the dropout rate in Norway has decreased. So as some reports have pointed out already, this indicates that teachers have applied more lenient grading standards during this time period. But overall, the pictures that emerges from these reports is that, at least from the perspective of teachers and students, the quality of education has declined during the times when remote instruction has been used. So now we'll move on to talk about studies that have tried to isolate the causal effect of distance learning on student outcomes using more objective learning measures. And we focus mainly on compulsory and upper secondary school, but I will still bring up some studies conducted among university studies, because there are a lot of well-done studies among university students that look at this question. And many have used randomized controls trials where they have randomized students between taking exactly the same course, either online or in the classroom. One that I want to mention is by Figlio and co-authors. They look at students in economics at an American university, and the students are randomized. They find negative effects of distance learning, and in particularly for weaker students group. This study is conducted at the highly selective American university. So all the students have generally a very high ability, high credentials to get into this university to begin with. The second study I want to mention is by Bettinger and co-authors. They look at a much more diverse university with a much more diverse student group, and for many different courses, not just economics. And they find large negative effects of distance learning. And they also find that it's the students with low prior GPA that are most negatively affected. In a recent review by Esqueta and co-authors, they reviewed this literature, and they conclude that in general, distance learning seemed to lead to negative effects. But the average effect is not always very large. It sort of depends on the context and the student population. Of course, the pandemic is a very different context, and some scholars have suggested that we should use the notion of emergency remote teaching instead. This is something very different than normal distance learning, because these courses are not necessarily designed to be delivered online. The teachers were not necessarily used to this way of teaching, and the time for preparation has often been limited, which then suggests that the negative effects could be larger. We have so far found one randomized controlled trial carried out during the pandemic. It's also from an American prestigious university. They find large negative effects of distance learning during the pandemic, which sort of is in line with that the effect might be more negative during the pandemic than before. So this was the university level. The negative effects presented at this level, the mechanism present at this level, we can also expect to find among younger students. But it's possible that the negative effects might be even larger among the younger, both because they are younger, but also because university students is a very selected group of high ability students. If we look at the effects among younger students, that there are considerably fewer studies, at least if we limit ourselves to the studies that we think are able to isolate the causal effect. But there are a couple well done, interesting studies, and the picture from these studies are in line with what you find for university studies. The first one I mentioned here is also a randomized controlled trial. They find negative effects for a group of relatively weak students. And the other paper is a paper that looks at the effect of switching from a traditional school to an online school. And they find negative effects on learning in math and language. But then again, the pandemic implied a lot of different challenges. And distance learning has, for instance, been used in a lot of subjects that are seen particularly ill-suited for this mode of instruction, for instance, practical elements, and also for students that seem that may be too young to handle this additional responsibility. A few studies have come out, during the pandemic. So far, most of the studies that we have seen, they look at countries, they use data from countries that seem to have faced a lot more challenges compared to the Nordic countries when it comes to access to technology. So it's hard to know whether they actually measure the effects of distance learning or the effect of having no instruction at all. But we have found some studies that seem more relevant. The first one by Engsel and co-authors come from the Netherlands, and the Netherlands, like the Nordic countries, seem very well prepared in terms of access to technology. They used the fact that the students, they took a standardized national test, both right before the school closure and right after. And then they can measure the progress during this time period and compare that to previous cohorts. And they find large negative effects on 8 to 11-year-olds' progress in math, spelling, and reading. And these are large enough for the authors to conclude that it seems like students barely made any progress at all during the time the school was closed. We found one study from Norway where they also look at a test taken right after school closure. And this is among first grade students, and they found a considerable learning loss in writing quality and fluency among these students. So these two studies are sort of in line with the idea that the young students may suffer particularly large learning losses from school closure. There is one Swedish study where they look at reading skills among children in grade 1 to 3, and they find no learning loss. And also Sweden did not close schools for this age group, so this is also not what we should expect. In the last section of our paper, we also touch upon some other aspects which we think is relevant for understanding how effective remote learning will be, specifically for younger students. So in many countries, as I touched upon before, school closures may be more accurately described as absence of schooling rather than remote schooling, for instance, due to lack of parental support or technology. Question is this a perspective that in some cases is also relevant for the Nordic countries? For the younger kids, except for in Sweden, instruction has often been a combination of homeschooling and schooling at the school during periods of the pandemic. But the distancing has also altered a lot of other things in the school, how teaching was organized, the number of hours of instruction, how students were assessed. One potentially important aspect is that in both Norway and Denmark, classes were sometimes divided into smaller groups during to be able to keep more distance. And one question one could ask is whether a smaller class size then could mitigate some of the potentially negative effects of distance learning. So I will talk a bit about this and some other related aspects. There's quite a large literature that in different ways try to measure how much students actually learn in school during a certain period of time using many different methodologies. For instance, assessing learning loss from temporary school closures or comparing kids who start school at different ages. And using these measures, we can sort of get we can assess the extent of learning loss we can expect from a certain amount of missed teaching. So this gives us an idea how large the learning loss due to school closure could be in the case where the lost in-person instruction is not compensated by equally effective remote instruction. So it gives us sort of an upper limit on the potential loss of knowledge. A recent review article by Eckert, he takes a look at this literature, concluding that many studies suggest that one extra year of schooling improves performance by 20 to 30% of the standard deviation. So if we take that measure to the amount of school closures experienced in Norway, Denmark, and Finland during the first term of the pandemic, which was 4 to 9 weeks, we arrive at a number suggesting that the short-run impact on test scores could be expected to vary from 2.5 to 6% of a standard deviation, and this would be relevant for those with the weakest ability and condition. That is, assuming that they did not learn anything at all. To no change at all for those students where the remote instruction fully compensated for the missed teaching in person. There are several papers in this literature also that try to assess more long-term effects, looking at years of completed schooling or earnings, using, for instance, different educational reforms in order to isolate the effect. There's quite a lot of variation in estimates in this literature, but most seem to conclude that, yes, more schooling, more instructions lead to higher earnings in the long run. In the review by Eckert, he concludes that most evidence indicates that time in school instruction in the effect of time in school persists later in life, and that one additional year of instruction increases income by about 2 to 3%. So if we take that to the amount of school closures during the first semester of the pandemic, that would suggest that earnings would decrease by at most 0.3 to 0.6% of and that is again assuming that the students didn't learn anything during school closure. Shortly about the impact of class size. Could a smaller class size, should we think that that would compensate for some of these potentially negative effects? There's a large literature on the impact of class size. Most studies using credible designs finds that yes, smaller class size seem to improve student performance. There are also studies that find that this was not the case, so it's not completely conclusive. But another aspect that's relevant to take into account here is also the fact that the smaller class size in this context seem to have often been made possible by recruiting other staff from the school to do the teaching. So we have a smaller class size sometimes, but at the same time, less qualified teachers in some of these groups. So we, taken together, we find it questionable whether we should expect this smaller class size to compensate for some of the negative effects of distance learning. Yes. Again, the youngest students are more dependent on parental assistance, and we know that the possibility to handle this extra responsibility is not equal across families. It's very well known that family background has a decisive influence on the development of both cognitive and non-cognitive skills. We also know that the time parents spend helping their kids with their schoolwork varies a lot with socioeconomic background. There's an interesting time use study from the UK during the pandemic, and they find that socioeconomic differences in learning time increased for smaller kids during the pandemic. And they conclude that it's very likely that the socioeconomic background would have a larger influence on student performance during the pandemic than before. The UK, of course, is not representative of the Nordic countries. They had much more school closures. Income differences are much larger, but there is a Danish study that find evidence pointing in the same direction. They find that there's normally a socioeconomic gradient in the takeout of library books, but this increased during the pandemic compared to before. And lastly, a note on the impact of canceled exams. Many point out that remote instructions makes it hard to grade. Assess and grade students. And in all Nordic countries except Iceland, a standardized national exams were cancelled. So that means that we don't have the same objective assessments of students' knowledge compared to before, making it tricky to study the effect of school closures on student learning. Standardized exams generally play an important role in capturing teacher bias. And it's possible that not having this objective assessments of students' knowledge would also delay the recognition both of students with high potential, but also of students with learning difficulties. And this delayed recognition could also affect students' learning in the longer run. But also having important exams like standardized national exams may also affect how much effort the students put into their schoolwork. There is a large literature on graduation standards, and a picture that emerged from that literature is that the effects of, for instance, introducing final exams is heterogeneous across students. It will induce some students to put more effort into their schoolwork, but it tend to also lead to a higher dropout rate, where less students of lower ability might be triggered to drop out instead. So we think that the canceled national exams could have a heterogeneous impact. Some students may have chosen to remain in education longer when these exams were cancelled, and this might be what we see in the Norwegian case where the dropout rate has decreased from high school. But other students probably decided to put less effort into studying when there were no longer any national exams. So altogether, the previous literature suggests that 4 to 9 weeks of missed teaching could lead to reduced earnings in adulthood by 0.3 to 0.6%, and that is if no policies are put in place to compensate the setback. And this type of learning loss and subsequent income loss we can expect if the schooling that took place at home was far less effective than the normal schooling taking place at school. The effectiveness of homeschooling will depend on the available resources in the home, especially parental resources. And this means that we can expect the socioeconomic disadvantaged children to suffer larger learning losses. And since the younger children are more dependent on the parental assistance, it means that we can expect learning losses to be particularly large for younger children. And this idea gets some support from the 2 studies that we found from the Netherlands and Norway that found large learning losses during lockdown for the youngest students. But in those cases, remote instruction works well and is equally effective as instruction in person, we should not, of course, not expect any long-term negative effects on human capital or earnings. The literature on effects of distance learning arrived at a very clear picture. Remote instruction tend to, on average, be less effective compared to instruction in person, but the effectiveness is very closely linked to student ability. For the weaker students, we see generally large effects, but the high ability students, those with highest previous grades, they are not necessarily negatively affected. You often don't see any effect at all for that group. All in all, it's clear from the literature that school closures can be expected to have long-run negative effects, and that these losses are unlikely to be equally distributed. Negative impacts likely to be larger for disadvantaged as well as for younger students, but they may also increase with the length of the school closure. So it means that we should not necessarily downplay potential effect for high school students, because high school that's the level that has been most closed in all countries. There are likely many more students in compulsory school in Norway, Finland, and Denmark who risk being negatively affected compared to Sweden. A question mark here again about Iceland. In upper secondary school, it seems that policies have been more similar across the Nordic countries. In all the countries, what we can see, there seems to be a large amount of regional variation. So within each country, it seems likely that there are regions and schools where students have been much more severely affected than elsewhere in terms of the fact that schools have been closed much more. But in the end, now we talked about potential effect given that no policies are put in place to compensate for these. And in the end, whether or not we will see long-term effects and how large they will be will of course depend on the policies put in place and the effectiveness of those policies to compensate for these potential long-run effects, negative effects. Thank you.
Thank you, Caroline. The first discussant of your paper is Hjördís Hardardottir from Iceland. Please, Hjördís.
Thank you so much. Where are you? There. For a very nice presentation of an interesting paper. As we now know, you have in a very nice manner summarized the situation regarding school closures in the Nordic countries, both with respect to what has been done, with the exception of Iceland partly. But at least to my memory, I have one point regarding what has been done during the autumn for primary schools, but I'm sure we can help you with filling the gaps regarding the lack of information there. Secondly, you have summarized the knowledge that as of now is existing regarding how the closures affect student outcomes. This literature is thin still, given that this is of course very recent. And but importantly, we can draw lessons from previous literature on the topic regarding school closures or schooling in general and distance learning as opposed to face-to-face learning and the effect of this on student performance. So this very nice summary of where we are and what the expected outcomes will be is, I think, very important for two reasons. So first, from a policy perspective, having access to this knowledge, this information packaged in a setting that is easily accessible and easily readable, is important for policymakers in education. As you said in the closing slide, the outcomes depend on the actions taken by policymakers in the educational sectors. So how should these policies be shaped? Well, in order to take actions, we need to know what we're dealing with. And this paper, I think, is a very good bridge from the academic literature on schooling and outcomes to the policy world. And I think it could be very helpful for shaping responses to schooling and COVID. Secondly, I think it is also interesting and provides an important to the academic literature. So in the Nordic countries, as we know, there is we have this rich availability of literacy data regarding outcomes. So given the fact that school closures during COVID were largely unprecedented, not only in the Nordics, of course, but in the world as a whole, but to study the effect of such a big event is, of course, interesting and should be done very thoroughly, and I believe will be done. But in order to do that, we need then access to data, both, as I said, on outcomes, which is there in the registries, and on the measures taken. And here, I think the summary, with the exception of Iceland, which will be better soon, is a very good starting point for researchers to look at and gain knowledge about what has been done when and where at different school levels. And I really hope to see studies that look at not only the short-run effects of disclosures on performance, but also on educational attainment, earnings, and so on as time goes. A second point that I thought about, I already talked to you during the coffee pause, so you know what I'm going to talk about. But of course, the studying the pure effect of the closures on learning outcomes is important. But I think when it comes to the long run effects of the closures on, for example, earnings, the social part of the school closure is also important. So in previous literature that has looked at the relationship between schooling and earnings, for example, mostly people have been studying additional year of schooling, for example, and how it affects earnings. Here, we have a situation where kids are experiencing lack of schooling or switch to distance learning, which is less effective. And in addition to that, there is a lack of social training, one might say, that would otherwise occur in schools, right? And I don't know the literature super well, but I guess that the effect of social training and the gathering of social skills that happens in school has a positive effect on lifetime earnings. So in this aspect, I think it would have been very nice to have information on, for example, whether the distance learning that took place was synchronous or asynchronous. So, I mean, if the distance learning is asynchronous, meaning that students only looked at videos whenever they liked to and were not interacting with their peers or the teacher online, there would be no social interaction at all. If it would be synchronous, there would be some kind of a situation where people would be able to interact, at least to some point. And to look at the different effect of these types of distance learning on outcomes would be interesting, and perhaps give some insight into the social aspect of closures of schools on outcomes. Regarding, we also discussed the mental effect of closures, and this, of course, relates to the social aspect. I mean, how does this lack of routine, perhaps lack of social interaction, affect the mental well-being of youth? And I think it would be interesting to, just like with the social aspect, to better investigate the role of mental well-being of kids and how it affects performance, both in the short run and in the long run. Otherwise, just want to emphasize again that I thought the paper was very nice, very good summary of what where we are, of what has been done, and what the literature, the academic literature on the topic, tells us what the consequences might be for the Nordics. Yes, just big thank you for a nice paper.
Well, thank you, Hjördís. The next discussant is Hanna Virtanen.
Hello. Hi, can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Okay, thank you. Hopefully you can see my slides well. Okay, so thank you for having me. Unfortunately, not able to be there, but at least something good has come out of the pandemic. These possibilities to join remotely have improved significantly. So it was a pleasure to read the paper by Caroline Hall and co-authors. And it's very nice to see this topic discussed in a forum like this. So the possible negative effects of school closures and pandemic on children might be significant, and there can be long-lasting effects on society and economy in general. And it's important to understand these effects so we can start reacting accordingly and trying to compensate on these negative effects. So very nice to read this paper, and it was an interesting read. I have mainly comments on the empirical evidence and maybe just pointing out some aspects that might be relevant to the topic. So the paper reviews the literature on distance learning and school closures. And as it's discussed very well in the paper, it's very important to consider what is the treatment when we try to generalize the results in this situation. So especially the term emergence remote teaching, I think it's very illustrative. So if we think of the literature before pandemic, the online distance learning was well thought out, prepared. Now during pandemic, there was little time to react. It was quickly organized, maybe with unprepared teachers and so on. So this is important distinction. Also, I think the studying environment might be very different during pandemic. You have other people in the house, maybe stressed parents trying to do their work and siblings and so on. So it certainly might be very different to have distance learning during COVID than what was before. So also distinction with real-time or self-paced instructions might be important. Unfortunately, there's not information on really the what type of distance learning was used during the pandemic. It would be very useful to understand what works better and what type of distance learning is worse. But I think this is covered well in the draft as it is. Maybe what's a little bit missing is the discussion of the alternative for distance learning. So what's the counterfactual? So before pandemic, I would assume that these papers have counterfactual is the normal classroom learning, but during pandemic, this might be also different. So the schools were closed with the idea that this would decrease the transmissions. So now there's this empirical evidence on this topic also piling, but I think it should be considered what if closing schools has an effect on transmissions, then this effect on children and their families, increased sicknesses, illnesses during having school might have significant effect on their learning. And then even if there wouldn't be illnesses necessarily, then still the amount of quarantines might increase. And then during remote learning, this might mean that you still can participate in schooling, but in case the schools are open, being in isolation in home might mean that you're also missing out on school. So I think this should be at least discussed, and the potential stress on teachers and children, their families, how it might be different during distance learning, or if you have face-to-face teaching during pandemic. And my other comment about the empirical evidence, so the current draft reviews research on distance learning before pandemic, and obviously this might be very different, not only because the treatment is different, but also because the context is very different. So having this huge shock as sort of global pandemic shock to your family and neighborhood community might be then being in school might be very much more important during those times. So maybe the effects of school closures might be closer to those that we see during natural disasters like earthquakes or wildfires and so on. So that this research might be also quite relevant to the topic at hand. Obviously, it's quite difficult to disentangle the effect of general trauma during natural disasters and the effect of school closures, and the same goes with the literature rising from the COVID. So you have maybe schools are closing because there's more, the pandemic is spreading, and that's the effect on children. That's affecting children as well. So for example, if you compare the effects on learning in a regular year before pandemic in a certain time frame, and compare that to having school closures during pandemic, it's difficult to say what's affecting the learning. So it can be also the general situation going on. But that's not really important if we're just trying to evaluate what's the learning loss that's been now affected on children. But if we want to say that something about the policy of closing schools, then this identifying issue is very important. So as the previous commenter already mentioned, there's the question of why focus only on the educational outcomes and learning. So school closings might affect significantly the non-cognitive skills, mental health, physical health, and then they might have also long-lasting effects. So I think these outcomes might make an important addition to the review. But I think in general, what's said in the paper and what I agree with is that there's overwhelming and robust evidence that school closures have effect significantly students' outcomes, and especially the vulnerable students. And I think the big question is then what do we do next? So I think given the potential size of these effects, and especially if you also consider the effects on other outcomes, there needs to be a comprehensive recovery plan. So I think this, given the empirical evidence on how difficult it's typically makes students catch up, we will need substantial investments after this, or now starting hopefully as soon as possible. And as was pointed out by Caroline already, there's this inequality issue that's the school closures have potentially increased inequalities significantly, and then targeting resources seems like a good idea. And then there are all sorts of things we can learn from the literature, so tutoring or all these type of investments, but I think then that should be a topic for maybe a next review commission, hopefully. So just one more point on what we can learn about this. I think it's important that policymakers are also thinking about this gaining information while things are happening. So for example, now this point that we can't make this distinction between different types of distance learning. So in order for researchers to provide such information, we would need to gain access to information, what's being used. And also thinking about the designing policies. So the pandemic was obviously a horrific shock, and then thinking about designing policies and making research possible wasn't the first thing, I think, in anyone's minds. But then during the second year, where the schools closures actually started become more common, then in this case, when we don't know how it's affecting children and their families, there should have been maybe some consideration where researchers would have been involved to consider how can we do this, that we learn for the future as much as possible. So I think I end with that, and thanks again for this opportunity.
Hands to comment on our discussions before we open the floor for questions.
Yes, I want to thank both commentators for very insightful comments, very good comments. I took notes of a few that I want to comment on. I strongly agree that I think whether it's real-time in teaching or whether it's independent study is potentially very important. It seems to what we can see from the policies put in place that decision is often like it's up to the school and the teachers to decide what mode of instruction to use. And we haven't been able to find information on this. It's also, I mean, there are a lot of, we believe that it's been a lot of real-time instruction, but we haven't found any detailed information. And it might also be the case that it's more so for the older students compared to the very young students. And the question is if a student in grade 1 to 3 is able to take care of the technology enough to follow that type of interaction, especially if the parents are there and they need to coordinate teaching the kid with their own work. So there might be an age gradient, but we haven't found any data, unfortunately. Yes, I think what's the counterfactual? That's it's a big question, and yeah, we need to think more about that. And in general, we think that, as Hanna brought up, that, I mean, yes, what is the effect of the pandemic in general on students and their families? Or if we're talking about what's the effect of school closures, it's not always easy to distinguish the two. We try to talk about the effect of school closures, but in order to maybe to make it more easy for ourselves, but these are not easily separated, of course. But very, very good comments from both commentators that we'll try to take into account when we continue to work on this.
Caroline, can you remain there? We have a question here from the floor.
There was a question in the chat, Caroline. If you could repeat what you said about cancelling national exams, and does that imply that we will probably never have quantitative estimates of learning loss?
Well, there will be, at least in Sweden, there will be 2 years of gap for many students where it will be hard to assess. We can, like as time go on, we can look at the effects on the labor market. That will give us some idea. But from a researcher's perspective, this was very unfortunate. Although at the same time, it's hard to imagine what it would be like to carry out with the national exams with the amount of transmission and the other practical elements. So that might have been the only way to go. I mean, there are also countries that have tried to have national exams during the pandemic, kids answering tests from at home, and the difficulty then is, did the students do this answer independently? Did they get help from their parents answering this? So they still don't know whether or not they can trust the results. So yeah, it's difficult.
So I have 2 reflections, partly inspired by the commentators. I should introduce myself, perhaps for those who can't see me. I'm Oskar Nordström-Skans from Uppsala University and one of the editors of this thing. The first one is, I think, isn't it the case also that when you have these kind of school closures, that a lot of the students, in particular the most disadvantaged ones, are missing out a lot of the support systems that they have that also come from the school, I guess in the Swedish context at least, food and counseling services, and probably also special assistance for those who have special needs. So maybe this is something that's worth discussing also as a mechanism. And the second one is maybe related in terms of the specific context where this is taking place. It seems perhaps that the lack of social interactions that comes about with school closures is maybe particularly severe in this context, because essentially all the other arenas that the kids have for social interactions were shut down as well, because kids can't do sports, they can't play music or whatever kids do in their spare time. So that may perhaps also make the consequences of that margin more severe during this time.
Yes, I agree. I think it seems to be the case that many countries, they still wanted to provide this support for special needs students, for instance, during the pandemic. So there were extra support put in place, but then at the same time, there are reports from these countries indicating that in practice, it still didn't work very well to reach this group. So I think it's potentially very important. Yes. Yes, but I agree. It's an important point. Yeah.
Okay. Hi, thanks, Caroline, for a really nice talk. One question. There's one. I know that from many countries we have a bit disturbing evidence that the reported cases of child maltreatment are going sharply down exactly at the same time when the schools are closing down. So this is a bit related to the social costs of closing down schools, but I think that schools are also places where we do, that are like a window to, what happens within families. And because I know that there's some research already done and some statistics on that, I think that this could be one additional thing that you could discuss, especially when we move on to the longer term impacts of school closures.
Yes, thank you. Yeah, I agree. I've heard such reports from Sweden as well. Yeah, so it's we did discuss it to some extent, but maybe not enough. It's a bit hard to put limits and not expand in all possible directions. But I agree that this is a very important issue.
Thank you very much, Caroline. Very interesting. We will now close this part of the session, and